In October 1900, Great Britain held a general election known as the Khaki election, dominated by the fever of the Boer War in South Africa. Winston Churchill stood as the Conservative candidate for the industrial town of Oldham. Only a year earlier, he had contested this same seat and lost. But this time, the dynamic had changed. He returned to England not just as a politician, but as the most famous young man in the empire. His exploits in South Africa had become legend. He had been captured by the Boers, imprisoned in Pretoria, and made a daring escape by climbing over a wall, hiding in a rat-infested coal mine, and stowing away on a freight train to cross the border into Portuguese East Africa. The voters of Oldham were swept up in the mania surrounding his return. They elected the war hero to Parliament with a handsome majority. On February 14, 1901, Churchill formally took his seat in the House of Commons. He was 26 years old. As he walked into the chamber, he took his place on the Conservative benches, the same party his father, Lord Randolph Churchill, had once led. To the old guard of the Victorian establishment, Winston appeared as the loyal heir, destined for a swift and conventional rise to the top of the Tory party. They were mistaken. Churchill was not built for convention. He was a man of restless energy and independent thought who found the rigid discipline of party politics suffocating. Within just a few years, he would shock the establishment by abandoning his father's party and defecting to the Liberals. This episode follows the turbulent middle years of Churchill's life. It is a narrative defined by extreme oscillation between absolute power and total powerlessness. We will follow his rapid ascent to the highest offices of state, his catastrophic fall during the First World War, and his long, lonely exile in the 1930s. It is the story of how the celebrity war hero of 1900 became the prophetic outcast of 1939, unwittingly preparing himself for the supreme challenge that lay ahead. Part 1. The Radical and the First Lord. When Winston Churchill first took his seat on the green benches of the House of Commons on February 14, 1901, the expectation was that he would be a dutiful recruit for the Conservative Party. He was 26 years old, a hero of the Boer War, and the son of a Tory icon. But within weeks of his arrival, it became clear that he had no intention of following the party line. In his maiden speech, he did not offer the usual platitudes expected of a new member. Instead, he launched a biting critique of his own government's military policy. The Secretary of State for War had proposed expanding the army to prepare for future conflicts. Churchill, channeling the thriftiness of his father, Lord Randolph Churchill, argued that the money should stay in the pockets of the taxpayer. He warned that a European war would be a catastrophe that would result in the ruin of the victor as well as the vanquished. He quickly fell in with a small clique of aristocratic renegades within the party, known as the Hooligans, led by Lord Hugh Cecil. They delighted in tormenting the Conservative leadership with devastating oratory and procedural ambushes. Yet, these early skirmishes over army expenditure were merely a prelude to the great ideological schism that would define the era. The fracture began in earnest in May 1903. Joseph Chamberlain, the powerful colonial secretary and the darling of the Conservative faithful, dropped a political bombshell. He declared that the era of free trade was over. Chamberlain advocated for a policy known as tariff reform. He proposed placing taxes on imports from foreign countries while allowing goods from the British Empire to enter duty-free. He argued this would bind the empire together and protect British industry from German and American competition. For Winston Churchill, this was heresy. He had been raised on the dogma of free trade. To him and to many Victorians, the free exchange of goods was the engine of global peace and British prosperity. More politically dangerous was the fact that tariff reform inevitably meant taxing food imports. Churchill knew that in a country that could not feed itself, food taxes would mean higher bread prices for the working class. He saw the policy as a scheme to enrich wealthy landowners at the expense of the poor. The conflict between Churchill and the Conservative leadership rapidly turned poisonous. Throughout 1903, Churchill attacked the government with increasing ferocity. He studied the economic data and memorized statistics to dismantle Chamberlain's arguments. He did not limit his attacks to the privacy of the party meetings. He campaigned openly in the country and corresponded with the Liberal opposition. The atmosphere in the House of Commons became hostile. The Conservative Prime Minister, Arthur Balfour, viewed Churchill as a traitor. The rank-and-file Tory MPs viewed him as an opportunist who was betraying his class. The hostility peaked during a debate when Churchill rose to speak, and the Conservative MPs stood up en masse and walked out of the chamber. They left him standing alone, shouting his arguments to the empty green leather benches of his own side, while the Liberals across the aisle cheered him on. The final break occurred in 1904. The local Conservative Association in his constituency of Oldham passed a vote of no confidence in him, effectively deselecting him for the next election. He had nowhere left to go. On May 31, 1904, Churchill entered the House of Commons, stood for a moment at the bar of the House, and then deliberately walked across the floor to sit on the Liberal benches. He had defected to the opposition. The move was calculated. The Conservative government was crumbling, exhausted by the Boer War, and divided by the tariff debate. The Liberals were on the rise. In the general election of 1906, the Liberals achieved a landslide victory. Churchill, running for a seat in Manchester, won easily. At the age of 31, he was appointed Under-Secretary of State for the Colonies. 2 years later, he entered the cabinet as President of the Board of Trade. It was here that he formed the most significant political partnership of his early career. He allied himself with the Chancellor of the Exchequer, David Lloyd George. Lloyd George was a Welsh radical, a fiery orator who burned with a desire to alleviate the poverty that plagued Edwardian Britain. Churchill, despite his aristocratic background, found himself drawn to Lloyd George's vision. Together, they became the driving force behind the New Liberalism, a movement that sought to use the power of the state to improve social conditions. They made a formidable team. Lloyd George provided the populist fire and the political cunning, while Churchill provided the administrative energy and the eloquence to sell their radical ideas to the public. They looked to Germany, where Otto von Bismarck had introduced social insurance decades earlier. Churchill visited Germany in 1908 to study their system of labor exchanges. He returned convinced that the state had a duty to provide a safety net for its citizens. In 1909, Churchill introduced the Labor Exchanges Act. This legislation created a network of state-run offices designed to help unemployed workers find jobs. It was a novel concept in a country where unemployment had previously been treated as a personal moral failing rather than a systemic economic issue. He argued that the modern industrial system was subject to fluctuations beyond the control of the individual worker, and therefore the machinery of government must intervene to organize the labor market. The partners then turned their attention to a more ambitious project: unemployment insurance. The National Insurance Act of 1911 was a landmark in British social history. It introduced a compulsory system where workers, employers, and the state all contributed to a fund that would provide sickness and unemployment benefits. This was the foundation of the British welfare state. Churchill pushed the bill through Parliament with relentless determination, arguing that it would bring security to millions of households that lived in fear of a sudden loss of income. While he was reshaping the social fabric of the nation, Churchill was promoted to the office of Home Secretary in 1910. At 35, he was the youngest man to hold the post since Robert Peel. The Home Office was responsible for the police and the prison system, a role that placed Churchill in charge of domestic order during a period of rising unrest. He faced strikes in the coal mines and increasingly militant protests from the suffragette movement. However, one specific event during his tenure came to define his public image as a man addicted to action. In December 1910, a gang of Latvian anarchists attempted to rob a jeweller in Houndsditch, London. During the escape, they shot and killed 3 policemen. The police launched a massive manhunt, which culminated on January 3, 1911. The suspects were traced to a house at number 100 Sydney Street in the East End of London. The police surrounded the building, but the anarchists were well armed with Mauser pistols and refused to surrender. A gun battle erupted. The police, armed only with revolvers and shotguns, found themselves outgunned. They appealed to the military for assistance. A detachment of Scots Guards was dispatched from the Tower of London. Upon hearing of the siege, Churchill did not remain at his desk in Whitehall. He drove directly to the scene of the fighting. The Home Secretary arrived at Sydney Street wearing a top hat and a fur-collared coat. He positioned himself among the police and soldiers, peering around corners to observe the exchange of fire. Newsreel cameras captured images of the senior government minister standing in the danger zone while bullets chipped the bricks of the buildings around him. The siege ended when the house caught fire. The fire brigade arrived, but Churchill intervened. He ordered them not to approach the building while the gunman was still shooting. He made the controversial decision to let the house burn rather than risk the lives of the firemen. The roof eventually collapsed, and the charred bodies of 2 anarchists were found in the ruins. The incident at Sydney Street drew sharp criticism. The Prime Minister, Herbert Henry Asquith, bemusedly remarked on his colleagues' inability to resist the sound of gunfire. The press accused Churchill of grandstanding and behaving like a schoolboy playing at war. However, the event reinforced the public perception of Churchill as a man of physical courage who preferred the front line to the committee room. Later in 1911, the focus of the British government shifted from domestic radicalism to international danger. The Agadir crisis, where a German gunboat challenged French control in Morocco, revealed the growing ambition of the German Empire. The prospect of war in Europe moved from a theoretical possibility to a tangible threat. Prime Minister Asquith decided that the Royal Navy, the shield of the Empire, needed new leadership. The current administration of the Admiralty was seen as lethargic and resistant to change. Asquith needed a minister with the energy to modernize the fleet and the intellect to grasp the changing nature of naval warfare. In October 1911, he appointed Winston Churchill as First Lord of the Admiralty. Churchill threw himself into the role with characteristic obsession. He turned the Admiralty chart room into his personal command center. He spent weeks aboard the Admiralty yacht, the Enchantress, visiting naval bases, inspecting dockyards, and grilling captains and engineers. He quickly concluded that the German high seas fleet was being built for a direct challenge to British naval supremacy in the North Sea. To meet this challenge, he initiated a revolution in naval technology and strategy. His most consequential decision involved the fuel that powered the fleet. For decades, the Royal Navy had run on coal. Britain had an abundance of high-quality Welsh steam coal, a secure and domestic energy source. Oil, by contrast, had to be imported from overseas, making the fleet vulnerable to supply disruptions. However, oil offered superior advantages. It burned hotter, allowing ships to reach higher speeds. It produced less smoke, making the ships harder to spot on the horizon. It could be refueled at sea, extending the range and endurance of the vessels. Churchill decided that the tactical advantages outweighed the strategic risks. He committed the Royal Navy to a new generation of battleships, the Queen Elizabeth class, designed to burn oil. To secure the necessary supply, he negotiated a deal in which the British government purchased a controlling stake in the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. This agreement not only secured fuel for the fleet, but also entangled the British government in the politics of the Middle East for the rest of the century. Along with the shift to oil, Churchill pushed for greater firepower. Against the advice of his naval experts, who believed the technology was unproven, he ordered the new battleships to be fitted with 15-inch guns. These massive weapons could fire a shell weighing nearly 2,000 pounds over a distance of 20 miles. When the guns were tested, they performed exactly as Churchill had predicted, giving the Royal Navy a critical advantage in range and hitting power. Churchill's vision extended beyond the sea. He was one of the first statesmen to grasp the military potential of aviation. In 1911, the aeroplane was still a fragile novelty, viewed by many admirals as a toy. Churchill saw it as a vital instrument for reconnaissance and spotting the fall of artillery shells. He founded the Royal Naval Air Service, the precursor to the Fleet Air Arm. He did not just authorize the budget for planes, he wanted to understand the experience of flight. He began taking flying lessons, a highly dangerous pursuit in an era when engine failure was common. After a series of crashes involving his instructors and friends, his wife Clementine begged him to stop. He eventually agreed to cease piloting, but his patronage of the air service ensured that when war came, the Navy possessed a sophisticated air wing. By the summer of 1914, the transformation was largely complete. The Royal Navy had been reorganized, re-equipped, and repositioned to face the German threat across the North Sea. In July 1914, as the diplomatic crisis following the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand began to spiral, the Royal Navy gathered at Spithead for a grand review. It was the most powerful concentration of naval power the world had ever seen. When the review concluded, the ships were scheduled to disperse and return to their home ports. As the political situation in Europe deteriorated, Churchill made the decision on his own authority to keep the fleet concentrated. He ordered the ships to steam north to their war station at Scapa Flow in the Orkney Islands. When the ultimatum to Germany expired on August 4, 1914, the British fleet was already in position, locking the German navy into its harbours. The radical social reformer had become the architect of the British war machine. The First Lord had prepared the weapon. Now he would have to use it. Part 2. The Fall. Gallipoli to the trenches. By the winter of 1914, the war that was supposed to be over by Christmas had frozen into a horrific stalemate. The mobile warfare of the opening months had vanished, replaced by a continuous scar of trenches stretching 450 miles from the Swiss border to the North Sea. On the Western Front, generals on both sides grappled with a new and terrifying reality. The defensive power of the machine gun and barbed wire made frontal assaults suicidal. Yet, the military leadership of Britain and France could see no other way to win than to feed more men into the meat grinder of Flanders, trading thousands of lives for yards of mud. Winston Churchill viewed this static attrition with intellectual and emotional revulsion. He argued that the war could not be won by chewing barbed wire in France. He believed that the British Empire was fundamentally a sea power, and it should use its navy to bypass the deadlock on land. While the generals on the Western Front demanded more artillery and more divisions, Churchill spent his nights in the Admiralty map room searching for a strategic alternative. He looked away from the main theatre of the war to the flanks. His eyes settled on the eastern Mediterranean. The Ottoman Empire had entered the war on the side of Germany in late 1914. This closed the Dardanelles Strait, the vital waterway connecting the Mediterranean to the Black Sea. This blockade was slowly strangling Russia, Britain's ally in the east. Russia had millions of men but no rifles to arm them, and it could not export its vast harvest of wheat to pay for munitions. Churchill reasoned that if the Royal Navy could force its way through the Dardanelles and capture Constantinople, the Ottoman Empire would be knocked out of the war. Russia would be resupplied, the Balkan states would be encouraged to join the Allies, and Germany would be attacked from its vulnerable southern flank. It was a strategic vision of immense grandeur, intended to shorten the war by years. The plan relied on the supremacy of the battleship. Churchill believed that older ships, obsolete for the main battle against the German fleet in the North Sea, could be used to bombard the Turkish forts guarding the straits. Once the forts were silenced, minesweepers would clear the channel, and the fleet would sail triumphantly to the Turkish capital. The War Council, desperate for any alternative to the slaughter in France, approved the operation. On March 18, 1915, the attack began. It was the greatest concentration of naval firepower ever seen in the Mediterranean. A mighty armada of British and French battleships steamed into the Dardanelles. At first, the operation seemed to be a brilliant success. The heavy guns hammered the Turkish forts, silencing their batteries and exploding their magazines. By early afternoon, the Allied fleet was dominating the straits. The Turkish gunners were running low on ammunition, and panic was beginning to spread in Constantinople. However, the straits concealed a silent danger. Unknown to the British, a small Turkish vessel, the Nusret, had laid a new line of naval mines in a bay where the Allied ships turned to maneuver. Disaster struck in the early afternoon. The French battleship Bouvet struck one of these mines. The explosion was catastrophic. The ship capsized and sank in less than 2 minutes, taking over 600 men to the bottom. The commanders were stunned, but the horror was not over. Shortly after, the British battleship HMS Irresistible struck a mine and began to list. Then HMS Ocean struck another. The naval commander on the spot, Admiral John de Robeck, lost his nerve. He saw his capital ship sinking and believed the waters were full of floating mines that could not be cleared. He ordered the fleet to withdraw. Churchill was distraught. He possessed intelligence suggesting the Turks were on the verge of surrender. He urged the admiral to renew the attack the next day, arguing that a few ships were a small price to pay for knocking an empire out of the war. But the commanders on the scene hesitated, and the momentum was lost. The initiative passed from the Navy to the Army. The government decided that the navy could not succeed alone and that troops must be landed to capture the Gallipoli Peninsula and destroy the forts from the land. On April 25, 1915, the landings began. British, French, and Anzac troops stormed the beaches of Gallipoli. Instead of a swift march to Constantinople, they found themselves pinned down on narrow strips of sand beneath steep, fortified cliffs. The Turks, commanded by the capable German general Liman von Sanders and a brilliant Turkish officer named Mustafa Kemal, held the high ground. The strategic brilliance of the naval plan was replaced by the brute force of an infantry assault. The deadlock of the Western Front had simply been recreated in the heat and dust of the Mediterranean. The campaign degenerated into a bloody siege characterized by dysentery, swarms of flies that blackened the food, and futile assaults against entrenched machine guns. The beautiful turquoise waters of the Aegean turned red with blood. As the casualty lists from Gallipoli mounted, the political atmosphere in London turned toxic. Churchill, as the most vocal proponent of the campaign, became the target of intense criticism. He was accused of amateur strategy and reckless gambling with human lives. He was dubbed the Butcher of Gallipoli. The pressure on the government reached a breaking point in May 1915. The first Sea Lord, Admiral John Fisher, was 74 years old. He was the man who had built the modern navy, and Churchill had brought him out of retirement to serve as his professional head of the service. Their relationship was a volatile mix of genius and paranoia. Fisher had initially supported the Dardanelles, but grew increasingly fearful that the operation would weaken the fleet in the North Sea. He feared that while the navy was distracted in Turkey, the German high seas fleet would sally out and attack Britain. On May 15th, the tension between the young politician and the old admiral exploded. Fisher resigned in protest against the ongoing drain of ships to the Mediterranean. He did not just resign, he deserted his post. He cleared his desk, pulled the blinds down, and left the Admiralty building, leaving a note for the Prime Minister that read, "I have locked the door." The resignation of the country's most famous sailor shattered the credibility of the Liberal government. Prime Minister Herbert Henry Asquith realized his administration could not survive the scandal. To stay in power, he had to form a coalition government with the Conservative opposition. The Conservatives agreed to join, but they had one non-negotiable condition. Winston Churchill must be removed from the Admiralty. They had never forgiven him for defecting to the Liberals a decade earlier. They viewed him as a traitor to his class and a dangerous adventurer who had now led the navy into a debacle. Asquith, a man Churchill had served loyally, accepted the terms without a fight. On May 21st, Churchill was dismissed as First Lord of the Admiralty. He was devastated. He told a friend, "I am the victim of a political conspiracy. I am finished." In the reshuffle, he was given the post of Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. It was a position with a grand title but zero responsibility. He retained a seat in the cabinet, but he was excluded from the Inner War Committee where the decisions were made. For 6 months, Churchill languished in this political purgatory. He sat in his office at the duchy with nothing to do. He fell into a deep depression, which he later referred to as the Black Dog. He watched from the sidelines as the Gallipoli campaign, his great strategic hope, slowly bled to death before being evacuated at the end of the year. He tried to occupy his mind with painting, a hobby he took up during this period of despair to keep his mind off the war, but the inactivity was torture for a man of his energy. By November 1915, he could take it no longer. He decided that if he could not direct the war from Whitehall, he would participate in it as a soldier. He wrote a resignation letter to the Prime Minister stating, "I am a soldier and I must go to the front." He packed his kit and crossed the Channel to France. The fall was absolute. A few months earlier, he had directed the movements of the greatest fleet in history, living in the splendor of the Admiralty House. Now, he reported for duty as a major in the British Army, sleeping in a wet dugout. The military authorities were unsure what to do with him. The commander of the British Expeditionary Force, Sir John French, offered him a brigade, but Churchill insisted on learning the ropes of trench warfare first. He was eventually given command of the 6th Battalion of the Royal Scots Fusiliers. When he arrived to take command in January 1916, the reception was frosty. The officers of the battalion were career soldiers who viewed him as a failed politician looking for a publicity stunt. The previous commander had been popular, and the men were suspicious of this intruder from Westminster. Churchill disarmed them with a mixture of eccentricity and genuine leadership. He arrived with a bizarre collection of kit, including a French steel helmet, which he claimed was more comfortable than the British version, and a long waterproof coat. At his first dinner with the officers, he famously broke the ice by demanding, "Gentlemen, I will not offer any excuses for the fact that I am not a teetotaler." The battalion was stationed in Belgium in a sector known as Ploegsteert. The British soldiers, struggling with the Flemish pronunciation, simply called it Plug Street. It was considered a quiet sector, but in the First World War, quiet was a relative term. Snipers, artillery shells, and mortar fire were constant hazards. Churchill threw himself into the welfare of his men with the same obsessive detail he had applied to the Navy. He was horrified by the conditions in the trenches, particularly the infestation of lice that tormented the soldiers. He declared a war on lice. He organized systematic bathing and clothing exchanges, bullying the supply depots to send fresh shirts and socks. He argued that a soldier who was itching and miserable could not fight effectively. He improved the food, ensuring the men had hot meals, and organized sports days to keep morale high. Slowly, the suspicion of the Scots Fusiliers turned to affection. They realized that the old man, as they called him, actually cared. He won their respect primarily through his physical courage. He refused to act like a headquarters general. He made a point of visiting the sentry posts in the middle of the night, wading through the freezing mud to check on the guards. He would often lead reconnaissance patrols into no man's land himself. Armed with a pistol and a flashlight, he would crawl through the long grass towards the German lines, seemingly oblivious to the danger. On one occasion, his flashlight failed while he was tangled in barbed wire, only yards from a German listening post, yet he returned to his own lines calmly, as if he had been out for an evening stroll. One specific incident at Plug Street reinforced his belief in his own destiny. In February 1916, a general requested Churchill's presence for a meeting a few miles behind the lines. Churchill was annoyed at having to leave his post and walked through the mud to the rendezvous point. The car that was supposed to pick him up had been delayed by enemy shelling. He waited in the rain, furious at the inefficiency and the waste of his time. When he finally returned to his battalion headquarters later that day, he found a scene of devastation. A German whiz-bang shell had scored a direct hit on the shelter where he would have been sleeping had he not been called away. The dugout was demolished. The officer who had been inside, a young man whom Churchill had been playing bridge with the night before, had been decapitated. Churchill stared at the ruin of his shelter. He later wrote to his wife, Clementine, that he felt a strong sense that a hand had been stretched out to save him. Despite his success as a battalion commander, Churchill remained a politician at heart. He kept a close watch on events in London. He saw the slaughter of the Somme approaching and grew frustrated that his talents were being wasted in a muddy field in Flanders while the government mismanaged the war effort. In May 1916, his battalion was merged with another unit due to heavy losses across the army. It gave him an honourable exit. He had served his time at the front. He had proven his courage and cleared his reputation of cowardice. He said goodbye to his Scots Fusiliers, shaking the hand of every officer, and returned to the House of Commons. He shook the mud of Plug Street from his boots, ready to fight his way back to the centre of power. The trenches had not killed him. They had rehabilitated him. Part 3. The Return and the General Strike. Winston Churchill returned to London from the trenches in the spring of 1916, but his path back to power was blocked. The Conservative Party still viewed him with deep suspicion, regarding him as the man who had wrecked the Dardanelles campaign. For over a year, he sat on the opposition benches, a frustrated spectator as the war dragged on. However, the dynamics of British politics were shifting. In December 1916, the Liberal Prime Minister Herbert Henry Asquith was ousted in a political coup engineered by David Lloyd George. Lloyd George formed a new coalition government focused entirely on the vigorous prosecution of the war. Lloyd George knew that Churchill possessed a unique genius for administration and a relentless drive that the war effort required. He wanted his old ally back. The Conservatives in the coalition threatened to resign if Churchill was given a cabinet post, but by July 1917, Lloyd George felt strong enough to ignore their protests. He appointed Churchill as Minister of Munitions. The Ministry of Munitions was a colossal industrial empire. By 1917, it controlled the employment of over 2 million workers and managed an annual budget of £700 million. Churchill was no longer a soldier in the mud. He was the industrial titan supplying the armies. He threw himself into the task of organizing the British war economy. He reorganized the department, cut through red tape, and accelerated the production of shells, guns, and aircraft. Under his leadership, the supply of artillery shells to the Western Front finally began to match the insatiable demand of the guns. Crucially, this position allowed Churchill to nurture a project he had started at the Admiralty, the landship. During his time as First Lord, he had used naval funds to develop a vehicle capable of crossing trenches and crushing barbed wire. The army had been skeptical, but by 1917, the potential of the tank was becoming undeniable. As Minister of Munitions, Churchill prioritized their production. When the British Army launched the Battle of Cambrai in November 1917, nearly 500 tanks rolled across the German lines, proving that the deadlock of the trenches could be broken by mechanical warfare. The war ended in November 1918, but peace did not bring tranquility to Winston Churchill. In January 1919, Lloyd George moved him to the War Office, making him Secretary of State for War and Air. His primary task was the complex and volatile process of demobilizing millions of conscript soldiers who were desperate to go home. While he managed this difficult logistical feat with considerable skill, his attention was consumed by a new threat rising in the East. The Russian Revolution of 1917 had toppled the Tsar and brought the Bolsheviks to power. Churchill viewed the regime of Vladimir Lenin with absolute horror. While many in Britain were war-weary and indifferent to events in Russia, Churchill saw Bolshevism as a contagion that threatened civilization itself. He described the Bolsheviks as a foul baboonry, and argued passionately that the Allied powers must intervene to destroy the new regime. He became the primary advocate for the White Russian forces fighting against the Red Army in the Russian Civil War. He shipped vast quantities of surplus British munitions to the anti-Bolshevik generals and authorized the deployment of British troops to ports in northern Russia and the Black Sea. He famously declared that the world must strangle Bolshevism in its cradle. This crusade put him at odds with the public mood and with the Prime Minister. Lloyd George was a pragmatist who believed that Britain had to trade with Russia, regardless of its government. The British Labour movement, growing in power, launched a hands-off Russia campaign, threatening strikes if the intervention continued. Churchill found himself isolated once again. The White Russian armies collapsed, the British troops were withdrawn, and the Soviet Union survived. Churchill's private war against Lenin solidified his reputation among the British working class as a reactionary militarist. The political landscape of Britain was fracturing. The Liberal Party, Churchill's political home since 1904, was disintegrating. It was being squeezed between the rising Labour Party on the left and the resurgent Conservative Party on the right. In 1922, the coalition government collapsed. In the subsequent general election, Churchill lost his seat in Dundee. It was a crushing defeat. He found himself, as he humorously noted, without an office, without a seat, without a party, and without an appendix, having undergone emergency surgery just days before the vote. For 2 years, Churchill was out of Parliament. He watched as the first Labour government took office in 1924. To Churchill, the rise of the Labour Party, with its socialist constitution, was a domestic echo of the Bolshevik threat he had fought in Russia. He decided that the Liberal Party was no longer a strong enough bulwark against socialism. He began to drift back toward the Conservatives. He stood for election in 1924 as a constitutionalist, a label that allowed him to bridge the gap between his liberal past and his conservative future. He won the seat of Epping and took his place once again on the Conservative benches. He had crossed the floor for the second time in his career. When accused of inconsistency, he offered a witty defense. Anyone can rat, but it takes a certain ingenuity to re-rat. The new Conservative Prime Minister was Stanley Baldwin. Baldwin was a shrewd operator who recognized that it was safer to have Churchill inside the tent than outside, causing trouble. In November 1924, he offered Churchill the post of Chancellor of the Exchequer. It was a stunning appointment. Churchill had expected a minor role. Instead, he was given the second most powerful job in the government, the same office his father had held 40 years earlier. Churchill arrived at the Treasury with grand ambitions, but limited economic experience. His tenure was dominated by a single, momentous decision, the return to the gold standard. Before the war, the British pound had been pegged to gold at a rate of $4.86. The war had forced Britain to suspend this convertibility. The financial establishment, the Bank of England, and the City of London were unanimous in their belief that Britain must return to gold at the pre-war parity to restore London's position as the world's financial centre. Churchill was sceptical. He instinctively felt that pegging the pound at such a high rate would make British exports expensive and lead to unemployment. He challenged his advisers, asking them to justify why the currency should be valued higher than its market reality. However, he was ultimately swayed by the experts. In the budget of 1925, he announced the return to the gold standard. The results were damaging. The economist John Maynard Keynes wrote a scathing pamphlet titled The Economic Consequences of Mr. Churchill, predicting that the decision would force industry to lower wages to remain competitive. Keynes was right. The high value of the pound devastated the export-dependent coal industry. Mine owners, facing falling profits, announced that they would cut the miners' wages and increase their working hours. The miners refused to accept the cuts. The dispute simmered for a year, with the government subsidizing the industry to buy time. In May 1926, the subsidy expired, and the owners locked the miners out. The Trades Union Congress, the TUC, called for a general strike in support of the miners. On May 3, 1926, Britain came to a standstill. Transport workers, dockers, printers, and steelworkers walked off the job. It was the largest industrial dispute in British history. For Winston Churchill, it was an insurrection. He believed that a general strike was a challenge to the constitutional authority of Parliament. If the unions could shut down the country, they, not the government, were the true rulers. Churchill plunged into the crisis with the same combative energy he had shown at Sydney Street and in the war. Since the printers were on strike, the newspapers had ceased publication. Churchill commandeered the presses of the Morning Post and created a government newspaper called the British Gazette. He appointed himself editor. For just over a week, Churchill ran the British Gazette as a propaganda sheet. He published aggressive editorials, framing the strike as a revolutionary movement that threatened the British way of life. He suppressed conciliatory messages even from the Archbishop of Canterbury and focused on rallying the middle class to keep the country running. He advocated for the use of troops to escort food convoys from the docks. I do not agree that the TUC has as much right as the government to publish their side of the case and exhort their followers to continue action, he declared. It is a very much more difficult task to feed the nation than it is to wreck it. His belligerence alarmed even his cabinet colleagues. Prime Minister Baldwin urged moderation, fearing that Churchill's rhetoric would drive the strikers toward violence. But Churchill was in his element. He viewed the strike as a battle to be won, demanding unconditional surrender. The general strike collapsed after 9 days. The TUC called off the action on May 12th, leaving the miners to fight on alone for months until they were starved back to work. The government had won, but the cost to Churchill's reputation was high. In the eyes of the working class and the labour movement, he was now the ultimate enemy. He was the man who had sent troops to shoot strikers in Wales in 1910, the man who wanted to starve the Russians, and now the man who had used the power of the state to crush the trade unions. By 1929, Winston Churchill was 54 years old. He held one of the highest offices in the land and had re-established himself at the heart of the Conservative Party. Yet he was increasingly out of step with the times. The age of mass democracy and labour rights viewed him as a relic of a bygone Victorian era. The general strike had solidified his image as a class warrior, a reputation that would haunt him for decades. As the 1920s drew to a close, the voters were preparing to deliver their verdict on the Conservative government, and Churchill was about to face the longest and darkest period of his career. Part 4. The Wilderness Years. In May 1929, the British electorate delivered a decisive verdict on the Conservative government. The Labour Party was returned as the largest party in the House of Commons. For Winston Churchill, the defeat was personal, financial, and profound. He ceased to be the Chancellor of the Exchequer and was cast out of the cabinet. At the age of 54, he found himself on the opposition backbenches, a position he had not occupied for decades. Most political observers believed his career was effectively over. He was viewed as a brilliant but unstable relic, a Victorian adventurer who had no place in the modern world of party machines and mass democracy. This period of exclusion, which would last for 10 long years, became known as the Wilderness Years. While the political world moved on without him, Churchill retreated to his beloved country home Chartwell in Kent. However, it was not a peaceful retirement. In October 1929, the Wall Street crash wiped out the American stock market. Churchill, who had invested heavily in American shares, lost a fortune. He was virtually bankrupt. To maintain his lavish lifestyle, which included a large staff, a heated swimming pool, and a wine cellar stocked with Pol Roger champagne, he had to work. Chartwell was transformed into a literary factory. Churchill treated writing with the same discipline he had applied to government. He employed a team of research assistants and secretaries who worked in shifts. He would often dictate until 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, pacing the room in his velvet boiler suit, while a weary secretary struggled to keep up with his torrent of words. During this decade, he produced an engaging autobiography, My Early Life, and wrote hundreds of lucrative newspaper articles for the Daily Mail and the Evening Standard. He opined on every conceivable topic, from the rise of dictators to the possibility of extraterrestrial life. But his primary focus was a massive 4-volume biography of his ancestor, John Churchill, the first Duke of Marlborough. It was more than a commercial enterprise to pay the bills. It was a study in grand strategy and coalition warfare. As Churchill detailed how his ancestor had led a European alliance against the hegemonic ambitions of Louis XIV of France, he began to see terrifying parallels with the current state of Europe. He became convinced that history was repeating itself and that a new tyrant was rising on the continent. When he was not writing, Churchill sought solace in physical labor to keep his mental demons at bay. He had always been prone to bouts of deep depression, a condition he famously called his black dog. To exhaust himself physically, he learned the trade of bricklaying. He joined the Amalgamated Union of Building Trade Workers as an adult apprentice. Visitors to Chartwell would often find the former Chancellor of the Exchequer dressed in dungarees, trowel in hand, building walls, cottages and heated garden ponds on his estate. He laid bricks with the same intensity he had once applied to the budget, finding a therapeutic rhythm in the mortar and stone. However, Churchill could not stay away from the House of Commons. In 1931, a financial crisis forced the formation of a national government, a coalition of Labour, Conservatives and Liberals. When the cabinet posts were assigned, Churchill was conspicuously ignored. He was excluded not just because of his past volatility, but because he had placed himself in violent opposition to the leadership of his own party regarding the future of India. The British government, led by Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald and the Conservative leader Stanley Baldwin, was moving toward granting India Dominion status. This would give India a degree of self-government similar to Canada or Australia. To the establishment, this was a necessary and just evolution. To Churchill, it was an act of surrender. He believed that British rule in India was the jewel of the empire and the guarantor of peace between religious factions. He argued that walking away would lead to sectarian carnage and the decline of Britain as a great power. His opposition was ferocious. He broke with the Conservative leadership and resigned from the Shadow Cabinet in January 1931 to lead the India Defence League. He toured the country, addressing mass meetings and warning against the betrayal of the empire. It was during this campaign that he launched a personal attack on the leader of the Indian independence movement, Mohandas Gandhi. In February 1931, Churchill spoke to the Council of the West Essex Conservative Association. He described his revulsion at the sight of Gandhi, a lawyer who had studied in London, striding half-naked up the steps of the vice-regal palace to negotiate on equal terms with the representative of the King-Emperor. He called Gandhi a seditious Middle Temple lawyer posing as a fakir. The remarks were widely reported and caused a sensation. To the younger generation of politicians and the moderate public, Churchill sounded like a reactionary bigot, a man clinging to the Victorian values of conquest and domination in an era of negotiation and rights. The India campaign separated Churchill from the mainstream of the Conservative Party. It exhausted his political capital and made him appear to be a man with poor judgment who was obsessed with imagined dangers. This reputation for poor judgment was solidified during the abdication crisis of 1936. King Edward VIII wished to marry Wallis Simpson, an American socialite who had been divorced twice. The government, the Church of England, and the Dominions made it clear that they would not accept Mrs. Simpson as queen. The king faced a choice: the throne or the marriage. Churchill, a romantic monarchist who had known the king since he was a boy, allowed his personal loyalty to cloud his political sense. He believed the king was being bullied by the government. He urged for time and patience, convinced that if the king were allowed to make his case to the people, he would be supported. Churchill completely misread the public mood and the resolve of Parliament. On December 7, 1936, Churchill rose in the House of Commons to plead for the king. He was met with a wall of hostility. Members of Parliament, furious at the constitutional crisis the king had created, shouted him down. Cries of "sit down and drop it" echoed through the chamber. Churchill stood red-faced and flustered, unable to finish his sentences against the barrage of noise. He left the chamber humiliated. It was the lowest point of his career. One member of Parliament noted that Churchill was politically dead, the victim of his own brilliance and lack of judgment. Yet, while Churchill was destroying his reputation over India and the king, he was simultaneously constructing a dossier on the true threat to peace. In January 1933, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. While the British government pursued a policy of disarmament and hope, Churchill began to warn of the rearmament of the Third Reich. The government dismissed his warnings. They claimed that Germany was weak, that Hitler wanted peace, and that British intelligence showed no cause for alarm. But Churchill had his own private intelligence service. He was fed information by a secret network of civil servants and military officers who were terrified by what they saw happening in Germany and frustrated by the government's inaction. His key source was Major Desmond Morton. Morton lived just over the fence from Chartwell and was the head of the Industrial Intelligence Centre. With the tacit approval of the Prime Minister, but unknown to the rest of the cabinet, Morton fed Churchill detailed figures on German industrial production. He revealed that German factories were shifting to a war footing, producing munitions on a scale that violated the Treaty of Versailles. Another crucial source was Ralph Wigram, a senior official at the Foreign Office. Wigram was deeply concerned by the rise of the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. He believed the government was suppressing the truth about German air superiority. In breach of the Official Secrets Act, Wigram visited Chartwell and brought Churchill the actual air staff figures. These documents proved that Germany was building an air force capable of bombing London. Armed with this data, Churchill stood in the House of Commons month after month, reciting statistics that contradicted the government's comforting assurances. He detailed the formation of German panzer divisions and the rapid construction of the German air fleet. He warned that London was vulnerable to aerial bombardment. He spoke of the gathering storm that was about to break over Europe. Germany is arming, he told the House in 1934. She is doing so with fearful speed and method. The strain of this solitary campaign took a toll. Ralph Wigram, despairing at the government's refusal to act on his information, fell into a depression and committed suicide in 1936. Churchill attended the funeral, weeping openly. He felt the weight of the prophecy he was carrying. For years, he was a voice crying in the wilderness. The Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, and later Neville Chamberlain regarded him as a warmonger. They believed that rearmament would provoke Hitler and that the memories of the First World War were enough to deter anyone from starting a second. The crisis came to a head in 1938. Hitler demanded the annexation of the Sudetenland, the German-speaking border region of Czechoslovakia. It appeared that war was imminent. Trenches were dug in London parks and gas masks were distributed to civilians. But the British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, was determined to avoid conflict. He flew to Germany 3 times to negotiate with Hitler. On September 30, 1938, Chamberlain returned from Munich. He stepped out of his plane at Heston Aerodrome waving a piece of paper signed by Herr Hitler. He declared that he had secured peace with honor and peace for our time. The relief was overwhelming. Chamberlain was hailed as a hero. He was invited to Buckingham Palace to appear on the balcony with the King and Queen. The country celebrated the avoidance of war. In the House of Commons, the mood was euphoric. But Winston Churchill refused to join the celebration. On October 5th, he rose to deliver one of the most difficult speeches of his life. He had to tell a relieved nation that their relief was a delusion. As he spoke, the Conservative MPs around him sat in stony silence or groaned in protest. "We have sustained a total and unmitigated defeat," he declared. He dismantled the Munich Agreement, arguing that Britain had thrown a small democratic nation to the wolves to buy a temporary respite. He warned that this was not the end, but the beginning of the reckoning. "This is only the first sip, the first foretaste of a bitter cup which will be proffered to you year by year, unless by a supreme recovery of moral health and martial vigour we arise again and take our stand for freedom, as in the olden time." He was nearly alone. But the events of the following year proved the accuracy of his prophecy. In March 1939, Hitler broke the Munich Agreement and occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia. The policy of appeasement had collapsed. The mood in Britain shifted overnight. The public and the press, who had cheered Chamberlain, now looked to the man who had warned them all along. Billboards appeared in London with the slogan, "What price Churchill now?" During the long, hot summer of 1939, the pressure on the government to bring Churchill back into office grew intense. Newspaper editors and backbench MPs argued that, if war was coming, Britain needed its most experienced war minister. Chamberlain resisted. He still distrusted Churchill personally and politically. On September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. Britain issued an ultimatum demanding the withdrawal of German troops. No reply was received. At 11 o'clock on the morning of September 3rd, Neville Chamberlain sat at a microphone in the cabinet room and announced to the nation via radio that, consequently, this country is at war with Germany. That same afternoon, amidst the wail of the first air raid sirens, the House of Commons met. The atmosphere was grim. Chamberlain, looking exhausted and heartbroken, spoke of the collapse of his hopes. Shortly afterward, Churchill stood up. He did not gloat. Instead, he offered a message of solemn defiance. He spoke of the war of the unknown warriors and dedicated the nation to the destruction of Nazism. Later that evening, the Prime Minister summoned Churchill to Downing Street. He offered him his old post, First Lord of the Admiralty. It was the same office he had held in 1914, exactly a quarter of a century earlier. Churchill accepted. He drove to the Admiralty building in Whitehall. He walked through the same doors he had left in disgrace in 1915. He went to the same map room, sat in the same chair, and looked at the same charts of the North Sea. The wilderness years were over. The message went out from the Admiralty Board to every ship and naval station in the British Empire. It was a simple signal consisting of 3 words that flashed across the oceans of the world. Winston is back. This podcast was entirely produced by Andrew Scott. If you have any suggestions for topics or improvements, please get in contact.